Did you know it's quite literally impossible for the Bible to condemn homosexuality? Because the word homosexual and the concept of modern sexuality didn't exist until the late 19th century.
What's up, YouTube? Today we have the question, is homosexuality condemned in the Bible? Now, before we dive into this, I just want to do a little disclaimer. I recognize that the church has treated the LGBTQ community terribly in the past, and that there's a lot of emotion, a lot of heartbreak, a lot of personal experience tied up in this question. I'm not addressing that in this video. This is simply just the objective question of, did the writers of the Bible condemn homosexuality or not? And I think if somebody's not a Christian, that question should not matter to you unless you want to become one or you're already trying to follow Jesus in some type of way. Then that question is really important. So let's check out this video of self-proclaimed pastor. I wouldn't consider him a pastor, no offense to him, but Brandon Robertson, and a TED Talk that he did about homosexuality in the Bible. Let's check it out.
Did you know it's quite literally impossible for the Bible to condemn homosexuality? Because the word homosexual and the concept of modern sexuality didn't exist until the late 19th century. The Bible didn't have the word homosexual in it until 1946.
All right. We hear this argument a lot, that the Bible didn't have the word homosexuality in it till 1946, which is true. And to say because that word wasn't in it, it couldn't be condemning homosexuality. Here's my counter to that argument. This is my Big Study Bible. Every word that you've ever read in this Bible did not exist when the Bible was originally written. Because the Bible wasn't originally written in English. This is a terrible argument. Yeah, we've come up with a word to describe sexual orientation within the last 100 years. Just because they didn't have that word doesn't mean that they didn't understand it. And the second thing that he kind of mentions here is that they didn't have a modern concept of homosexuality. And so he's going to dive into that a little bit more later, and I'll respond then. Let's continue.
When the writers of the Revised Standard Version of the Bible placed that word in the Bible as the translation of a mysterious Greek word, arsenokoitai. This word arsenokoitai was so mysterious because it never appeared in the Bible until the Apostle Paul places it in the Bible, and it was never in the Greek language up until that point.
So this is actually a common rhetorical tactic to make this claim that this word is mysterious and unable to understand. There are people who at least had difficulty understanding it. I don't know why this is claimed, because what he's about to do is then describe what the word means. It's not mysterious. We know what the word means. He knows what the word means, and he's going to explain it. And it actually didn't take much to understand what the word meant, because it's tied back to the Old Testament and the Old Testament Levitical law about homosexuality. Or, if you don't want to use that word, about men who sleep with men.
And it's only used sparingly afterwards. Now, scholars believe this word comes from the book of Leviticus, 18:22, where it says, "A man shall not lie with a man, as with a woman, for this is an abomination." The word man there in Greek is arson, and the word to lie with is koiton. And so people believe that the Apostle Paul combined those two words together to create arsenokoitai, to refer to whatever Leviticus was referring to.
So just to be clear, the word literally means men who bed men, right? Arson, man, koitai, bed, men who lie with men, which is directly correlating with Leviticus 18:22, which we'll look at here in a sec.
Now, what exactly is Leviticus 18:22 referring to? It seems clear. A man shall not lie with a man as with a woman. But if you scroll out a little bit, you'll begin to realize it gets a little murkier. Leviticus 18, verses 1 and 3 say, "Do not do as they do in the land of Egypt, where I am bringing you from, and do not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you to. Do not follow their practices. Leviticus 18 is a part of the Hebrew Bible known as the Holiness Code. This is a section of law given to the ancient Jewish people to help keep them ritually and culturally pure from the nations that surrounded them. This isn't an ethical code, but a ritual and cultural one.
Okay. So now that he said that, that's his claim, that it's not an ethical code, but a ritual and cultural one. And I think in a general broad sense, like he's correct here. I think to say that there's no ethics involved and no, concepts of morality doesn't make any sense when we actually look at the passage. You can go read all of Leviticus 18. I just wanted to grab the portion that is surrounding 18:22 about men not lying with men as they lie with women. So there's a few things listed here, right? Don't approach a woman and uncover her nakedness while she's in her menstrual cycle. Okay. You should not lie sexually with your neighbor's wife, so you make yourself unclean with her. You don't think there's any moral implications in that? You should not give any of your children to offer them to Molech, which is child sacrifice. You don't think there's any moral implications to that? And then 23, and you shall not lie with an animal as to make yourself unclean with it, right? So, of course, there is a concept of cleanliness. I'm not rejecting that. But to say that there's no moral or ethical value in abstaining from these things doesn't make any sense. And I would say the Apostle Paul, because, okay, think about this. Brandon Robertson's argument is at the beginning of Leviticus 18, don't do what the people in Canaan and Egypt are doing. That's the problem here. That's what he's saying, right? Why does that not make any sense? Because Paul doesn't even see it that way. Paul is still quoting back to 18:22 in his time, thousands of years later, that has nothing to do with the Canaanites or the Egyptians. Paul sees the moral implications of sexual immorality, which is not shocking, right? I mean, it's not like surprising to read these and think that there's no moral or ethical implications to these laws. We continue on because he's going to kind of give his arguments about how to interpret it culturally.
And if you look through Leviticus 18, you'll find a bunch of prohibitions on things like incest and child sacrifice. And then this strange command, do not lie with a man as with a woman. So in order to understand what this verse means, you have to ask, where in ancient Egypt and Canaan was it permissible for men to engage with other men? Well, if you look at ancient Canaanite and Egyptian law, it's quite clear. Homosexuality was in general prohibited.
Okay. So that means people weren't doing it, right? Like the culture may be against it, and so that's a law against same-sex sexual relationships or relations, right? The Hebrew Israelite law had some similar laws to the other laws of the other cultures around them. This happens all the time in nations, and so he's going to try to kind of explain his way out of it.
So scholars have deduced that what was likely being referred to was one of three things. First, verse 22 could refer to something called sacred prostitution, which was an act where men and women would go and engage sexually with temple priests and priestesses to honor pagan deities. The second thing it could be is incest. Leviticus 18 contains almost 12 commands against incest, never against same-sex incest, and thus that could be a legitimate interpretation. Third, it could also be a command against exploitation. In many ancient cultures, it was permissible for men to engage with their slaves as a way of dominating them. Whatever interpretation you choose to take, what seems clear is that whatever's being condemned is nothing like modern, loving, consensual same-sex relationships.
So I'm sure all three of those things would be outlawed in Israel. Why? Because Leviticus 18:22 is a sweeping law. It's just any act where a man lies with a man as he would with a woman. There's no like stipulation in there. Well, unless they're doing this, then it's okay. Or unless it looks like this, then it's okay. It's a sweeping law. Paul does the same thing in 1 Corinthians 6. It's a sweeping law of just men who bed with men. That this is sin, and there's no stipulations. And what I find interesting is that this is the passage that often gets attacked. And the reason why I find that interesting is because Romans 1 is much harder to deal with. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves due penalty for their error. A lot harder to deal with because it's very plainly stated. And the counter argument is often, well, this is talking about idolatry. And in the general context of Romans 1, it is talking about idolatry because idolatry is sinful. And idolatry is at the root of all sin, including any sexual sin. As in, just because it's in the context of idolatry doesn't mean that there's a way out. And I'll get into that at the end of this, because the Bible actually has a clear sexual ethic for us that I want to talk about, but let's keep going.
Now, if you zoom out a little bit more and look at ancient sexuality in general, you'll find that the way the ancients conceived of sexuality is so different than our modern notion. Today, we believe sexual identity is innate. We are wired to be attracted to one gender or another or a spectrum of genders. But in the ancient world, it wasn't about what gender you were attracted to, but the social status of the person you were engaging with.
So we see this argument a lot, that today modern sexuality and how we understand it is so much different than how they saw it back in ancient times. And of course, to acknowledge that there are some cultural differences, but it's both naive and historically inaccurate to think that people 2,000 years ago didn't have a grasp on the idea of two people of the same sex, not just having intercourse, but actually being in love with one another, actually loving one another, desiring to be in a devoted relationship to one another. That's absolute nonsense, okay? We've got Plato's Symposium, like 300 years before Jesus. And in it, there's this speech called the Aristophanes, or from the Aristophanes, and it presents this myth about how humans were originally dual beings, some male-male, some female-female, and some male-female, until Zeus split them. And according to the myth, people spent their lives searching for their other half, including same-sex partners. As if your soulmate is out there and you were either a male-male, a female-female, or a male-female. And if you're a male-female, then you'd be searching for the opposite sex. But if you were a male-male or a female-female, you'd be searching for the same sex as the person who, in modern terms, as we'd say it, completes you. You don't think that they didn't understand same-sex love and attraction? And then you have just examples of it. You have Elagabalus. He was a Roman emperor in the 3rd century who, guess what? He got married to a man. You have a guy named Hadrian, another Roman emperor in the 2nd century. While he didn't get married, he was in a deeply devoted relationship to his lover, Antinous. I'm an idiot. Leave me alone. Antinous. And then, of course, maybe one of the most famous emperors is Emperor Nero, who married 2 different men. Now, Nero's a little crazy, but the idea that these men, Elagabalus or Hadrian, that they didn't love their same-sex partners, I just think it would be naive to say that they didn't. And so what you have here is a modern lie that's not historically accurate. And there's much more examples out there of same-sex relationships in the ancient world. I just wanted to give a few. Let's close this thing out.
So in the ancient Greco-Roman world of the Apostle Paul, if you were a Roman man, it was permissible for you to engage sexually with anybody who was lower on the social hierarchy than you, man or woman. Now, if that's truly how the ancients viewed sexuality, and we reject that patriarchal ordering of the world, and we concede that Leviticus isn't talking about anything akin to modern loving same-sex relationships, can we truly say that the Bible is condemning homosexuality? To me, it seemed we couldn't.
I'm not gonna lie, I don't even know if I believed him at the end. He's like, we could. He kind of hesitated, like we couldn't. I'm like, are you sure? Because I just want to point out three things as we think about the Bible that I think is really significant. One, the Bible has a clear sexual ethic. It's pretty consistent. It's consistent from the beginning. Genesis 1, from Judaism to Christianity, and it is this: that sex belongs in the confines of marriage between one man and one woman. Period. And wherever sex is taken outside of that context is viewed as wrong, no matter how it is happening. One man, one woman, period. And I think another thing to think about is that anywhere in the Bible where any type of same-sex relations is occurring, it is never celebrated and always condemned. So it doesn't matter what context you give it. It doesn't matter what's happening. It doesn't matter if it's Old Testament. It doesn't matter if it's New Testament. It doesn't matter if it's Rome. It doesn't matter if it's Egypt. It doesn't matter if it's Canaan. It's always viewed as sinful. So you have to completely reject that in order to say that the Bible approves of homosexual relationships. And the last thing I want to say to close this out is anyone who wants to follow Jesus will feel the cost of their sexual ethic. It doesn't matter if you have homosexual or heterosexual tendencies. To come to Christ is to say, not my will be done, but your will. And it doesn't matter how I feel and what I desire. And I just want to point that out, that it's not just homosexuals who feel this cost of suppressing or rejecting sexual desires. It's for heterosexuals too. But we simply look at Jesus and say, not my desires. They are not king. You are, and you're trustworthy, so I will follow you. And so I ultimately don't think that there's any good arguments, just if we look at the scriptures objectively, to say that they are pro any type of same-sex sexual relationships. It's not there. These are poor arguments. And I just wanted to address a few as I see my dog twitching in his sleep to close this thing out. And so, and I'll close out by saying, I am sensitive to people who have these desires and are wrestling, what does that mean for you in your life? That's just not the topic of this video. It's simply just the objective question, what do the scriptures say about homosexuality? So if you like it, if it's helpful, shoot me a like, hit the subscribe button. Y'all have a good one. Peace.